You are, I'm sure, familiar with the tale of Count Dracula, the world's most famous vampire, popularized by Bram Stoker in his novel of the same name. The story tells of an evil vampire named Dracula, who, through manipulation and cunning, sneaks from his home in Transylvania into England, where he begins terrorizing the populace by feeding on the blood of innocent men and women. He is ultimately defeated by brave men and women led by Ibrahim Van Helsing, and through their cleverness, bravery, and the aid of holy items like the cross. In many respects, Dracula was meant to be something of an Antichrist character, offering relief from death through undeath, taking the blood of others rather than offering up his own blood. In every way, Count Dracula is the ultimate evil, the antagonist to the ultimate good. And, of course, if you're familiar with Dracula, then you are familiar with the real-world Wallachian prince for whom he was named, Vlad III Dracula, also known as Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler, known as one of the most cruel, savage, and barbaric names to ever be given. A man whose name inspired fear and horror in all who knew him. A man so evil that it is said he dined amongst the corpses of his enemies, that he built for himself a forest of impaled victims all around his castle, and that he delighted in dipping his bread in the blood of his foes. All grueling, horrible stuff, and surely a most fitting inspiration for the vampire of Stoker's work. And yet, there's more to the man than this. Much more. While I love the story Dracula and find it a fascinating piece of literature, the real Vlad Dracula is far different from the vampire. And today, I'd like to tell you of the Dark Prince of Wallachia and the Hungarian hero. A man whose deeds struck more fear into the hearts of the Ottoman Empire than any undead vampire could. And a man who would never have shrunk back from the Holy Cross, but in fact, bore it before him as a badge of honor. Today, I will tell you of the Dread Lord Impaler, Vlad Dracula. Vlad's story, interestingly enough, does not begin with him, but rather with his father, Vlad II. In 1431, Sigismund, the king of Hungary at the time, inducted Vlad II into the Order of the Dragon, which was where the surname Dracul comes from, for it means the dragon. The Order of the Dragon was a knightly order founded with the purpose of defending Christendom from the Ottoman Turks, who had been invading and persecuting Christian lands for years at this point. 5 years later, after his coronation into the Order of the Dragon in 1436, Vlad II was named Voivode of Wallachia. A fine title to be sure, but he had a real problem. Wallachia was sandwiched between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, two opposing forces who used Wallachia and its surrounding lands as their chessboard on which to wage their wars. 1 year after becoming Voivode, or warlord, Sigismund, the King of Hungary, passed away. In 1437, and without a strong Hungarian monarch to support him, Vlad II was forced to kneel to Ottoman control for the sake of his own country. Without wasting any time, Sultan Murad II enlisted Vlad in a complete invasion of Transylvania, hauling off over 40,000 Christians as slaves. Vlad was dejected, but powerless, for Christendom at this point had no heroes left. However, after 1440, when the great John Hunyadi arose to rekindle crusading sentiments, Vlad II saw a potential opportunity to fight back. And this worried the Sultan, who immediately had his vassal shackled and thrown in prison. This proved to be a poor decision, though, because without Vlad II there to be his vassal, Murad had just left Wallachia with an empty throne, and John Hunyadi was more than ready to appoint an ally of his own there. Murad changed his mind quickly and decided to release Vlad back to his own throne, but on one condition. Vlad must leave behind his two youngest sons as hostages in his place. According to Manuel Doukas, an artist and scribe who documented the Ottoman Empire's exploits, quote, he, Vlad II, delivered them to the Sultan even though they were still adolescents. The youngest brother was Radu, and the older brother, Vlad III, named after his father. Vlad III was born sometime between 1428 and 1431. He received a standard noble education and experienced a very fierce upbringing. According to historian Raymond T. McNally, quote, "From the tenderest age, a great deal of physical emphasis was placed on physical fitness in Wallachia. Children were exposed to the elements on stormy nights in true Spartan tradition, and should they survive the chills and fevers of the accompanying colds, they were considered to have strong physical and moral character, which are essential traits in good warriors." While history would remember him as Vlad Tepish, which means Vlad the Impaler, his true name, which we can take from his signature, was rather Vlad Dracula, which means son of the dragon for his father. In his adulthood, as his reputation blackened and grew more sinister, many tried to retranslate the name to mean son of the devil to add to his already bad reputation. But I get ahead of myself, we will get to that point. Now, in 1442, when Vlad was about 12 years old and his younger brother Radu was 6, the only relationships Vlad knew were his jailers, who were of different religion and tongue, and his inmates. The circumstances for the two brothers was perilous, for they could be executed at any moment if their father failed to live according to the Sultan's wishes. In fact, their lives very nearly came to an end when their father sent his soldiers to participate in the Crusade of Varna in 1444. But, after that crusade failed, Vlad was essentially broken to the Ottomans. He refused to again raise troops or soldiers against him for fear of losing his sons. John Hunyadi was irritated with Vlad's indecisiveness and had him executed so that a new and more willing monarch may rule Wallachia and push back the Ottomans. Now, this may seem harsh, but if you look at a map of where Wallachia was located and where the Ottoman Empire is located, Wallachia needed a strong resistance in order to maintain Romanian independence from the Ottoman Empire. So, it was important to John Hunyadi that the leader of Wallachia would not waver. But this move from John Hunyadi didn't sit well with Sultan Murad, who didn't like the idea of a Hunyadi-owned Wallachia. And that's when he thought of Vlad Dracula. Unlike Radu, the youngest son, who was not only handsome but seemingly weaker in will, the young Vlad was fierce, formidable, and a fighter. He was prone to vicious and violent actions against his captors and was whipped so frequently that some jailers said it molded his body into diamond hardness. What a perfect vassal, thought Murad. So Murad sent Vlad III back to his home to rule in his father's place as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. It was made clear, however, that Vlad was to offer tribute to the Sultan and to pay him tribute. Vlad, only 18 years old at the time, would sit on the throne of Wallachia for only 2 months before another claimant came and drove him out. Vlad's name disappears from history for 6 years after that, and will only reappear again in 1456. And it was no peaceful return by any means. Vlad was now a warrior, honed and dangerous. The man on the throne of Wallachia, Vladislav II, was the same man who had executed Vlad's father. And now he would pay the price for it. Vlad challenged him to single combat and won. Now, 26 years of age, Vlad Dracula was home, and he was ready to stay. He began building a personal guard of loyal soldiers. And after that, it was time to deal with the disloyal subjects. One of the primary problems facing Christian lands at the time was noble infighting. It was very common for nobles and boyars to scheme and plot behind the scenes, weakening the internal structure and function of the lands. While the voivode may fight intently against the Ottomans, 3 nobles secretly make deals with the Sultan to sabotage their warlord and take power in his place. Vlad knew this well, and he was going to prevent that eventuality. In a scene to set hairs on end, Vlad Dracula invited all the boyars he suspected of treachery to a banquet in his castle. During the banquet, he laughed and joked with them and asked them, in a joking manner of course, how many voivodes had come and gone before him. The boyars and nobles laughed and said, many. Losing his smile, Vlad asked far more seriously, why? This frightened the boyars because they knew they were the reason. And Vlad knew it. Vlad gave the word, locked the doors to the hall, then he and his men butchered the traitorous boyars. After this, Dracula set to work rebuilding and reconstructing the military of his province. According to Chalkokondyles, a historian of the time, quote, He surrounded himself with a number of distinguished and devoted soldiers and servants to whom he gave the wealth and social positions of those boyars he killed, so that in a short time he brought about a radical change. He had completely altered the organization of Wallachia. But one question was left to be answered. Was Vlad loyal to the Ottomans? After all, the Sultan expected Vlad to offer homage and tribute. In September 1456, Vlad answered that question by swearing loyalty and fealty to Hungary, the arch-rival of the Ottomans. But Vlad knew the Sultan would not accept this. Before long, the Ottomans were massing an invading army and pressuring Vlad to open up his country to them so that they could cross through and attack Hungary. Vlad wrote a plea to his neighbors in Transylvania to send men to aid in the war effort. But not only did they refuse to send any help, but as was common at the time, the nobles and governors of Hungary, Brasov, and Transylvania were already plotting to remove Vlad and put in a new voivode of Wallachia who would be less disagreeable. And while this was going on, to make matters worse, the Saxons were violating the free trade agreement they'd made in Wallachia and were daring Vlad to do anything about it while he was still trying to hold off the Ottomans. Dracula had endured enough. First, he invaded the Saxon lands and butchered the populace, impaling thousands. Then, when the Brasov-sponsored invasion began so they could depose Vlad in 1460, Dracula crushed their forces easily, and then forced their leader, who had organized the treachery, to dig his own grave. Vlad gave him a funeral service done in the Christian tradition, and then had him beheaded beside his own tomb. Now, before we continue, it's important, after this terrible and horrifying account, that we discuss a few misunderstandings about Vlad. Many tend to use these events and actions to describe Vlad as a monster and psychopath, but there are a few things to bear in mind. The first is that impalement, while attributed to Vlad, was not an uncommon execution method at the time. In fact, it was a favored one of the Ottomans. In 1453, during the siege of Constantinople, after beheading all the sailors of a Venetian ship, Sultan Muhammad II ordered the life of its captain to be taken by a stake through the anus. Which leads to the next thing to consider. Much of Vlad's upbringing was surrounded by the Muslim Turks, who instilled in Vlad a deep understanding of terror as a form of control and combat. According to Kurt Treptow, a Dracula historian, quote, "Many of the horrific deeds attributed to Dracula were things he learned from the Ottomans. For example, after the carnage at Varna, Murad II held a, quote, feast among the corpses of vanquished Christians." It's clear that the cruelty and fierceness of Vlad was not something he himself invented, but something he adopted and used against his foes to great effect. The final point to make is that while it may seem cruel to many that Dracula would use these tactics against his would-be allies, historian Anton Bolota points out, quote, "Careful historical and economic research has pointed out that Dracula's invasion of the Transylvania lands of the Saxons was not a product of an evil policy of a voivode bent on massacres, but the result of a deliberate and conscious policy applied with a cruelty which was characteristic of the time. The policy of Dracula towards the Saxons was guided by the need for a strong resistance against the Turks." In other words, the tactics of Dracula were not uncommon for the time. Even the King of Hungary felt this way, as he wrote to the Transylvanians, quote, "You yourselves, through your greed, gave Vlad reason to come against you, causing great damage. For this you must bear most of the guilt." So, before we all sensationalize the cruelty and wickedness of Dracula, context must always be further understood. But, in any event, and in any case, by 1460, Vlad was now the unquestioned ruler of Wallachia. He married the daughter of the King of Hungary, and with her at his side, he announced his intent to revolt against the Ottomans. And now, it is at this point that the Ottomans must take action. Sultan Muhammad II was not happy about Vlad's decision to revolt. But Muhammad, also sometimes called Mehmet, was not fooled. He knew that the best tactic against the Balkan lands was to divide them and turn them against each other. So first, he tried diplomacy. In a story that has gone down as legendary, Mehmet sent 3 emissaries to Vlad's castle, demanding that he pay the 3 years' worth of tribute he had yet to deliver, but also to give 500 Christian children over for enslavement for the Janissary Corps. During the meeting, Vlad asked them why they did not remove their turbans in his presence. You see, in a Christian court, it was customary and tradition to remove headwear before royalty.
You speak of homage. Yet I noticed that none of you had the courtesy to remove your hats. when you enter my court.
But Vlad knew why they didn't. Even before they answered, he knew why. They told him, because by Ottoman custom and law, they were to keep their turbans on at all times in public.
Prince, you spent years in our court. You know that the Ottoman culture forbids us from removing our hats in public.
But you're in my court now.
Vlad replied coldly, quote, "And I shall uphold your law so that you will adhere to it firmly."
Ahmed can find a new ally. And you will never have to remove your hats again.
He then had his guards restrain the disrespectful messengers and nail the turbans to their heads. Now, most accounts say that this was an execution, but the chronicle goes on to say that he told the messengers afterwards, quote, "Tell your master to not send his customs and his demands to other lords who don't want them, and let him keep his customs to himself." Because he told them this implies he did not bury the nails deep enough to kill, only to keep the turbans fastened to their heads and to cause intense pain for the messengers. But the message was clear nonetheless. Vlad would not bow. Mehmet was furious, but not ready to give up. He decided to remove Vlad through trickery. He sent out two messages, one to Vlad and another to his secret servant in Nicopolis, Hamza Bey. The message to Vlad was that it would be beneficial for him to come and meet with the Sultan and court personally. Simply bring along his tribute and come unarmed, and they would be able to make amends. The message to Hamza was a little less friendly. The Sultan told Hamza he would be very grateful if he were to ambush Vlad on his way to Nicopolis and capture him. But Vlad knew it was a plot, and the Voivode of Wallachia was already prepared. He gathered 50 Wallachian children and a few chests of money to act as a portion of the tribute he would offer, and then rode out and crossed into Nicopolis. But what Hamza didn't know was that Dracula's personal guard was already armed, and he'd set his army to hide in the hills and attack on his command. So when Hamza tried to ambush him, it was not Hamza who sprung the trap. It was Dracula who pounced upon the ambushers, capturing Hamza. According to one Ottoman chronicler, the Bey, or Lord, of Wallachia, that damn son of a bitch, attacked Hamza Bey about midnight. He killed many Turks and took Hamza Bey prisoner. The infidels crossed the Danube at several places and made an incursion into the regions neighboring Wallachia and plundered, causing much damage to the Ottoman provinces. In honor of Hamza's position, though, Vlad made sure to impale him on a very high stake to reflect his very high position. Immediately after this, Vlad turned to the fortress of Georgiou in Nicopolis with 2,000 of his men. He approached under cover of night, pretending to be one of the Turkish soldiers. He spoke to the guards in fluent Turkish, which he had learned during his captivity as a child, and tricked the guards into lowering the drawbridge for him. With that, Vlad and his army razed the city, burning and killing as they went. An estimated 24,000 Turks were left dead. And with the gates of Nicopolis open to him, Dracula spent the next few days raiding Ottoman-controlled land, killing Turks of every age and gender. And after making the lands empty of the Ottoman control, he sought out any Christian families he could and shepherded them onto his own land, settling them there. And, to put the cherry on top of his victory, Dracula released a few Turkish men he'd captured and gave them a message for their sultan, which went thusly, quote, "Go. You will tell your sultan what you have seen. I have served him as far as I was able, and if my service is pleasing to him, I will serve him still as much as is in my power." According to Kurt Treptow, quote, "The Turks were so terror-stricken that those who could flee the Balkans and cross to Anatolia considered themselves fortunate. And as for Constantinople itself, there was an atmosphere of terror and gloom caused by the awesome reputation of Kaziglu Bey, the Ottoman title for Dracula, which means Lord Impaler." Now, before we proceed with Vlad's life, I believe now would be a good time to discuss an important aspect about Vlad Dracula that many might choose to ignore. Thanks to modern media and discussion, the prevailing view of Vlad Dracula is one of a cruel and vicious tyrant who took sadistic delight in butchering, impaling, and torturing others. It is from these vile and frightening accounts that many believe inspiration for Count Dracula the Vampire was spawned. In truth, though, Bram Stoker did little research on the actual Dracula, having only heard the rumors of him and liking the name. He did little to learn of the true man behind that name, though. I think it's time we peeled back the monster and look at the man for who he was. Unlike the fictional vampire who was repulsed by the divine and holy items, the true Vlad Dracula was an outspoken Christian. This may seem hard to believe given the nature of his more frightening and vicious actions, but it's important to bear in mind that his actions, viewed in the proper context, were not the result of a sick and demented mind bent on sadism, but came from a recognized and even accepted form of disciplinary policy. Vlad Dracula, after his victory in Ottoman lands, would go on to write to the King of Hungary the following, quote, "Know that we have done all that we could for the time being to harm those who kept urging us to leave the Christians and to take their side, that we have broken our peace with them not for our own benefit, but for the honor of the Holy Crown of your Majesty and the preservation of Christianity." It's important to understand who Dracula was and what he had done. Many today only know Dracula by his cruelty, but that cruelty must be held in proper context. Before his rule, the land was considered lawless and wild. According to Treptow, quote, "Wallachia was split apart. The people run to the mountains, to the valleys, and away anywhere they could from the cruel Turks, away from the Hungarian barbarians as well. The old men that the Turks cut down, the young ones they enslave, the girls they rape, the youth they capture and enroll in their armies. Wherever they pass, they burn the villages." And Romanian historian Anton Balota writes, "Dracula's policies introduced order in the country, and this helps explain his sudden resistance to the Turks, which he could not have organized previously without the help of his people." I say all this to make this point clear. Dracula may have been cruel, but he was as monstrous as he was moral. It is known that, above all things, Dracula hated stealing. There's a famous story in Romania called the Golden Goblet. In this story, Dracula supposedly left a golden jeweled goblet by a well that peasants visited regularly throughout the day. For however long the goblet was there, no one touched it. Vlad was swift and fierce with punishment for theft or wrongdoing in his country, and for this reason, the people felt safer and protected under Dracula. Evil and wrongdoing were met with terrible consequences, and this knowledge meant that any man or woman who was wronged would not feel the need to try and get revenge for themselves, for the wrath of Dracula would be all the punishment required. In fact, Dracula was just as harsh to those who did not carry their own weight. Referring to them as vagabonds, he once said of them, quote, "These men live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity. It is a form of thievery. In fact, the masked robber in the forest demanding your purse. But if you are quicker than your hand and more vigorous than he, you can escape from him. However, these vagabonds take your belongings gradually by begging, but they still take it. They are worse than robbers. May such be eradicated from my lands." In all things, Dracula was a man who brought balance and security to Wallachia. Hence why even to this day, Romania holds Vlad Dracula III as a national hero. Dracula was a hard and cunning man, but he had a heart, despite all the things attributed to him. Again, I know it may seem hard to believe, but this must be understood in order to understand the man that he was. But now that we've touched on that, let us continue with our journey through Vlad's life, now that we understand more of the man rather than the monster. When the Sultan launched his amphibious assault into Wallachia from the northern banks of the river, Vlad's soldiers lay in wait to ambush the Janissaries. When the Sultan finally made it himself, he found 250 dead Janissaries left on the shores. In a panic, Mehmet ordered cannons to be fired on Dracula's army. Seeing that staying there was pointless, Vlad retreated, allowing the Ottomans to land. But in the initial ambush, there was an impact on Mehmet. Fear had struck the Sultan, and it showed in his desperate and violent march through Wallachia. According to Sad Aldin, a chronicler of the Ottoman court, quote, "Shouting Allah lead us to victory, the soldiers passed through many places. They inflicted such merciless punishment on Wallachia that it seemed as if the end of the world had come, shedding much blood with their terrifying swords." Vlad was outnumbered, and the morale of his people was low. he was forced to resort to scorched earth and guerrilla hit-and-run tactics, hoping to wear down his enemy. Unfortunately, Vlad ran into two problems. First, Vlad's younger brother Radu, who had remained in Ottoman custody, was loyal to the Sultan, who some historians believe was his lover. More on that later. Radu, who had knowledge of Wallachia and his brother, was able to offer advice and direction on what to do and where to strike to do the most damage to the populace, including revealing the hiding places of women and children in the countryside. The second problem was that another Romanian prince, Stephen of Moldavia, who sought the throne of Wallachia for himself, was using this Ottoman invasion as an opportunity to attack Vlad and steal the throne from him. And to make matters worse, the Hungarians were still refusing to give any aid to Vlad, fearing it would only anger the Ottomans further against them. But from this, Vlad had become desperate, and from this desperation arose the most daring assault in world history, the infamous night raid of Dracula. If Dracula's army could not best the Ottomans, then he would sever the head of the snake and assassinate the Sultan. In the pitch-black night of June 16, 1462, near the Carpathian Mountains, Dracula, with near 7,000 horsemen, violently rode into the camp of the Sultan with lightning speed. They butchered countless Turks, hunting for the Sultan. Sultan Mehmet, hearing the commotion and the screams of his men, fled from the camp in terror. The attack lasted 6 hours and into the dawn. Unable to find the Sultan in the camp, Vlad retreated with his forces back into the mountains. Though he had failed to deal the death blow, the psychological impact of this attack was felt through the entire Ottoman army. The Sultan was found by his guard, and according to a Janissary source, had to be dragged back, as he was too afraid to return to the camp on his own power. And none of the Ottoman forces wished to pursue Dracula. As the terror of the night raid had gripped them so greatly, they were certain that to follow him meant death. One Janissary writes about how the night raid had affected the Turks by saying, quote, "Although the Romanian prince had a small army, we always advanced with great caution and fear, and spent nights sleeping in ditches that were surrounded with stakes. But even in this manner, we were not safe, for during one night the Romanians struck at us. They massacred several thousand Turks. The Sultan had incurred great losses." Vlad's attack had failed to get the desired result, and Vlad Dracula was feeling the pressure. But the Sultan fared little better. He was humiliated and terrified. It's documented that he ordered his men to round up as many Wallachians as they could and slaughter them to sate his rage. Ottoman noble Tursun Beg writes, quote, "Their heads were cut off to nourish the swords, for as the Quran says, the powerful sword must fall upon them and split them in two. So 3,700 infidels were brought to the Sultan alive and then cut in two." The boyars and the nobles of Wallachia who heard of this ran to the Sultan to beg for mercy and to appeal to him. In one account, Mehmet asked one noble if he knew where Dracula was hiding. The noble replied that he knew, but when Mehmet asked for the location, the man replied that he could not tell him. Mehmet said that if the man stayed silent, he would be killed. But the noble famously replied, quote, "He was more than ready to die, and would not dare to reveal anything about Vlad Dracula." When the Sultan and his followers saw that this noble was more willing to be tortured to death than spark the wrath of Dracula, this sent even more fear through the Ottoman ranks. And it was believed that the Sultan may have remarked, quote, "With such fear surrounding him, Dracula could be unstoppable." The Ottomans would continue their march towards Dracula's castle, but as they went, the fear they felt was growing steadily greater and greater. And then it all came to a head when they drew near Dracula's home. There they discovered something they hoped was only a legend, and now confirmed to be quite real. Writes Dracula historian McNally, quote, "Thousands of stakes of various heights held the remaining carcasses of some 20,000 Turkish captives. Their bodies were in a state of complete decomposition due to the heat of the summer. The ravens and other Carpathian birds of prey, many of which had made their nests within the skulls and remains of their victims. The entire area reeked with the stench of death, the smell of rotting flesh. Dracula had deliberately staged this sinister spectacle as part of his terror tactics to destroy whatever spirit was left in Mehmet after the unsuccessful assassination attempt." According to historical accounts, the forest of the impaled stretched all around Dracula's castle 6 miles in any direction. The Turks were left in an absolute panic, but what was worse, Dracula capitalized on that fear. As the Turks marched their way fearfully through the forest, any that strayed from the main group were set upon by Dracula and his forces, sowing even greater fear. Mehmet could no longer handle himself and ordered an immediate retreat from Wallachia. As his terrified army fled back to the Ottoman lands, Dracula's forces continued to attack and harass them, setting them into even more of a panic. When Mehmet returned to his home, it was without victory, and an ignominious one at that. It was a humiliating defeat, and the legendary Vlad Dracula, Lord Impaler, with a smaller force, had routed and sent back the Ottoman Sultan through the use of psychological warfare and terror tactics. Mehmet would never forget or forgive this defeat, but all of the Christian Europe would celebrate Vlad's victory. From all the way to Spain to the Balkans' highest points, Vlad's name was hailed as a hero. But for Vlad Dracula, no good deed goes unpunished. Do you remember Vlad's brother Radu? His story was quite horrific. Known as Radu the Handsome for his looks, the Sultan Mehmet had made sexual advancements on him as early as the age of 15, and though Radu had initially resisted, he eventually succumbed. He was loyal to his lover and to the Ottoman Empire. Plus, as Vlad's brother, he had just as much claim to the Wallachian throne as Vlad did. Mehmet used this as his means to get revenge on Vlad. He sent Radu to Wallachia to charm and win over the Dacians, Hungarians, and Transylvanians, and convinced them to help him remove Vlad and put himself on the throne. Since Mehmet had left Wallachia and was no longer an immediate threat, the boyars and nobles quickly forgot about Vlad's heroism and brave actions, and agreed with the charismatic Radu. Vlad was furious, and wrote to Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, to send him troops to help him expel Radu for good. And even the Pope expected Corvinus to aid Vlad at this time. But Matthias had grown jealous of Vlad's victories and fame, and was quite suspicious of him. The Saxons, who were still angry at Vlad for his treatment of them in 1459, saw their chance, and forged letters that implicated Vlad as agreeing to work with the Turks to overthrow Hungary. More than willing to accept these forgeries as real, despite all the evidence to the contrary, Matthias arrested and imprisoned Vlad Dracula. Everyone, including Matthias's own advisors and chronicler, were astounded by his actions, going so far to accuse the Hungarian king as being in league with the Turks. Needless to say, Pope Pius II, who was a bit of a fan of Vlad's, was furious at the Hungarian king's actions, demanding to know why he'd imprisoned Dracula. Knowing the letters wouldn't be enough to sway the Pope, Matthias began concocting stories and legends about Vlad Dracula, many of which you've likely heard attributed to him by modern storytellers and historians seeking to demonize the man today. Matthias began using his money to push the world's first recorded incident of fake news. Using the newly invented printing press, Matthias began publishing pamphlets and flyers telling people of, quote, the frightening and truly extraordinary story of a wicked, blood-drinking tyrant called Prince Dracula. These pamphlets told in graphic detail how Vlad supposedly boiled people alive, forced parents to eat their own children broiled, made husbands eat their wives' breasts, and forced Tatars to swallow their own semen, and many, many more disgusting and horrific things. Before anyone here suggests the validity of these stories, it's important to note that, when analyzing the first German set published, the text simply lists atrocity after horrible atrocity without ever mentioning once any form of reason or context behind them, claiming they were all done as mere sadism or wickedness. But by now, as I hope you come to understand, Vlad did nothing without cause or reason. It's also important to note that Dracula was beloved by the peasants of his home, and if any of these stories were remotely true, it's hard to believe that they would adore him the way they did. In fact, in many respects, Vlad Dracula was seen as a savior of Wallachia. While it can't be denied that Dracula did resort to cruel punishments, they were never without cause or merit, and as stated before, such punishments as impalement were not uncommon at the time. Not even for the Balkans. In fact, Stephen the Great, one of Romania's celebrated heroes, once had 2,300 Wallachians impaled. And as for the Saxons, they had impalement listed as a proper form of punishment for a variety of crimes. The difference between Dracula and his contemporaries, though, was twofold. One was in the quantity. Dracula clearly was far more prepared to deal out these punishments on a large scale, though it could be argued this was for tactical purposes, to strike fear in the hearts of his enemies. The other was his unyielding willingness to oppose the Ottomans. In a time when the Balkan lands were riled in indecisiveness, fear, and chaos, such a man who was so unafraid to get his hands dirty and take the fight to the enemy was a polarizing presence. To his citizens and peasants who had nothing left to lose and wanted peace and justice to reign, he was a hero and saint who they rallied to. But to the nobles, boyars, and kings who were used to diplomacy and were not as affected by Ottoman oppression in their own houses, Dracula was a threat to the fragile peace they sought for. For them, it was not about destroying the Ottomans, just lessening the pain of their presence. Dracula to them had to be removed. Dracula was imprisoned in 1462 and was held captive for 13 years, all the way until 1475. In that time, Radu the Handsome, his younger brother, became the voivode of Wallachia, and under his rule, the Ottomans enjoyed free reign and entry into Wallachian lands, without the fear of the Lord Impaler. The peasantry was now cowering in fear of the Ottoman Empire once again. According to rumor, Vlad was a model prisoner, though his countenance was threatening, and he demanded often to know how long he would be falsely held. And he got his answer in 1475. A Moldavian noble, Bazarab Leota, invaded Wallachia and killed Radu. The moment he ascended to the throne, he promised the Ottomans not only free access to Wallachia, but Moldavia as well. Stephen of Moldavia, who had at one point been one of Dracula's greatest enemies, was now backed into a corner. Wallachia was no longer a buffer anymore, but an open path for the Ottomans to sack their lands. In a letter written to Matthias of Hungary, Stephen requested the immediate removal of Bazarab from the Wallachian throne, and the enthroning of the Christian prince Dracula with whom they could collaborate. Matthias agreed. He freed Vlad immediately, declared him the true ruler of Wallachia, and even offered him his first cousin, Justina Silgai, in marriage. His first wife died not long after Vlad had been imprisoned. However, Matthias was worried about Dracula's abilities. After all, the Lord Impaler had been imprisoned for 13 years. Was he still the feared and dread Lord Impaler that he used to be? To make sure that he could get accustomed to normal society again, Matthias set him up in a small house in Pest so he could recuperate and become accustomed to the world again. During that time, an officer of the Hungarian court broke into Dracula's home in search of a runaway criminal that he believed was hiding in Dracula's house. Dracula immediately decapitated the officer with one swing of his sword. When Matthias asked why Dracula had killed the officer, Dracula responded thusly, quote, "I did not commit any crime. It is the police official who committed suicide. Anyone will perish in this way should he, like a thief, invade the house of a great ruler such as myself. If this man had come to me first and explained the situation to me, and if then the criminal had been found in my own home, I myself would have delivered the criminal over to him and would have pardoned him." Matthias was pleased. Dracula hadn't changed a bit, and he needed Dracula now more than ever. But it was time to test his skill in battle. Matthias named Dracula a captain in his army and sent him into various battles in 1476. He won many notable victories in Bosnia and Serbia. Vlad even offered assistance to his once enemy Stephen of Moldavia. He urged Stephen not to engage the Turks until he had joined up with them. He needed a few more days to reach him. Why? Because he was having his men chop down trees near the main road to block it off. When he finally joined up with Stephen and attacked, the terrified Turks tried to flee, only to be blocked by the tree trunks that blocked the main road. Vlad had left these trees to hinder their escape, and had done so successfully. By August of 1476, the Turks were completely driven from Moldavia. And with Moldavia safe again, and back in the hands of Stephen, Stephen was more than happy to offer his aid to Dracula in retaking his home of Wallachia. In November of the same year, Bazarab was forced to flee to the Ottoman Empire, and Dracula was again crowned ruler of Wallachia. But some of the nobles of Transylvania were afraid Dracula would attack them or harm them for their subjugation to Bazarab. To their surprise, though, Dracula restored trade with them and wrote to the officials saying, quote, "God has opened the roads to you everywhere. Therefore go now freely where you like and feed yourselves, and God will be pleased." The thing the Turks feared the most was coming to pass in the Balkans. Christian solidarity. For the first time, largely thanks to Dracula, Hungary, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Wallachia were working together. But, sadly, the third reign of Dracula was short. Only a month long, in fact. Details and accounts differ on what exactly happened, but what we do know is that in January 1477, Dracula was attacked, cut down, and his head decapitated and sent to the Ottomans. The most likely account of his death was written by Austrian chronicler Jacob Unrest in the 15th century. Quote, Dracula was killed with great cunning because the Turks wished to avenge the great enmity with which they had borne against them for so long, and also the great damage he inflicted upon them. They hired a Turk, posing as one of the servants, with the mission to kill him while he served him. The Turk was apparently instructed to attack Dracula from the back. He was then to cut off the head and bring it back on horseback to their sultan. When the sultan received Dracula's head, he thrust it atop the highest stake in Constantinople as proof to all the city of his death. Dracula was 47 years old at the time of his death, and only a fraction of it was spent ruling his people, though all of it helped him to become a legend. Kurt W. Triptow, the most recent author of Dracula's biography, said this of Dracula, quote, Vlad was both a heroic and tragic figure, a man who tried to shape history, but also one shaped by it. Vlad's greatness lies in the fact that he sought to rise above the limits placed upon him by time and place. It is natural to root for the underdog, the one who stands up to fight for what he believes is right against all odds. His heroic defiance of the most powerful empire of his day is, above all, what secured his place in the history of Europe. Vlad Dracula is notable for more than just this. It's important to note that thanks to his time in the service of the Ottomans as their captive, he had much to gain from cooperation with them. Had Dracula only been submissive and complacent, the Ottomans would have taken care of him, ensured he was wealthy and given money, wives, and land. But Dracula never submitted, never gave in, and was outspokenly in opposition to them. So much so that his entire life would be met by betrayal, not only from the Ottomans, but from his family and his allies. Even Matthias, the king who he swore allegiance to, would betray him and run his good name through the mud. It's also necessary to restate that, despite his diabolical reputation, Dracula was an outspoken Christian. He was often seen in the company of Romanian Orthodox monks and was fond of the monasteries in Trismania and Snagov, both of which he visited often. When imposing the death penalty, he always offered Christian burial rites. He founded the monastery of Comana, sent donations to Mount Athos, and laid the groundwork for a Romanian Orthodox church in his country. And upon constructing a fortress at Bucharest, it could be argued that he laid the foundations for the modern-day country of Romania. But alas, history does repeat itself. Where Vlad Dracula would build and unify once, later would propaganda and sensationalism demonize him. And thanks to Bram Stoker's work, Dracula's name is once again branded with the hot iron of sadistic, cruel, and evil. Though Stoker knew little of medieval Romania, and even less of Vlad, he loved the name and the propaganda that had been spread thanks to Matthias, and thus found a great name for his new monster. Though Vlad may be popular today in the West, it is not because of the good he did for Romania, or for his staunch and dedicated devotion to his country and his faith, but rather for the lies and slander spoken of him by those who feared him and were jealous of him. In the popular anime Hellsing Ultimate, the vampire Alucard reveals his identity as Vlad Dracula in the 8th episode, in which all the souls of people he's consumed are released. Among them, Alexander Anderson and Enrico Maxwell remark on how, among those legions, are not only Ottoman forces, but also the Wallachian peasants and soldiers he brutally murdered and feasted on.
The Kazan and the Janissary forces.
Malicus, it can't be. You consumed them. Your own soldiers. Your own subjects. You... Dracula!
Such a grotesque and horrific assumption of Dracula is not uncommon today, thanks in large part to this propaganda. As said before, Dracula was beloved by his subjects and by the peasantry. If he was truly one to consume and devour his own subjects, it's not likely he would have earned their respect and devotion. And yet at the same time, such terror was exactly what Dracula sought to inspire in his enemies. Terror of the dread Lord Impaler. Though his reputation turned against him on more than one occasion, it was through it that he brought temporary stability and even unity to Romanian lands. Of all the heroes of Christendom in the past, of all the men and women who stood opposed to oppression, evil, and injustice, few can be held in as high regard as Vlad III Dracula, a man who abandoned comfort for war, who chose to be feared rather than respected, who fought against endlessly impossible odds, but always with a will to bring liberty to his home, and with a sense of justice so fierce it frightened even his allies. The man who would be described as a monster with traces of a man. Truly, no name can carry a legacy quite like that of Vlad Dracula, the dread Lord Impaler.